Hello, everyone. This is Mathfinder, the home for every math nerd's Pathfinder optimization needs. If you're new here, welcome, and we're so glad to have you. If you've been here before, welcome back, and thank you so much for your continued support. Today's video is a topic I thought about while preparing some of the videos I'm working on for the future. One of the things that kept coming up as I was evaluating options like, say, property runes or spells was that I value conditions differently than a lot of the folks I talk to in the online community. I just have a different perception of them, and in particular, the three conditions I'm specifically going to talk about today will illustrate that. But I figured that means it's a good idea to have a short video on how I like to evaluate conditions, why I do it that way, and why it's useful for you as a player to think of them that way when thinking up your own tactics. So let's dive into it. Before talking about conditions and tactics though, I wanted to talk about the sponsor of today's video. Elderbrain is a publisher with a long history of publishing D&D 5e adventures and supplements, and recently they started branching out into Pathfinder 2nd edition. They converted their Mindscape series of one-shots into Pathfinder, and the first season is in progress. You should expect monthly releases, with the content getting deeper and wider as you go along. I directly worked on converting several of the one-shots that they created, and I can vouch for their quality. A great deal of care was taken to make sure that these are not just D&D one-shots that have been reflavored into Pathfinder, with the mechanics kind of being an afterthought, which I know is a real concern players tend to have about D&D content that gets converted to Pathfinder. This is not the case here. The designers are seasoned Pathfinder players, and the original creators give us a great deal of liberty to reinterpret their content into a Pathfinder-first way. We changed up the way certain dungeons work, we changed up the way certain scenarios work, just because we knew that simply porting what happened in D&D to Pathfinder wouldn't always be the most interesting thing to do. They also come with new magic items, new spells, new archetypes, and sometimes new subclasses, so I highly recommend checking them out. If you click the link in the video description below, they will know that I sent you, and if you use the coupon code of Mathfinder at checkout, you will get a little discount on the products. Of the one-shots released thus far, which I think there's 8 or so total, I have directly worked on 2 of them. Still It Rises, which is a level 1 to 4 one-shot, and Veils of Lavender, which is a levels 5 to 8 one-shot. And to be clear, those level ranges are not variable within the same party. Everyone in the same party is expected to be at the same level, and we have balanced the one-shots with that in mind. Those 2 are the ones I directly worked on, but again, I can vouch for the quality of every single one-shot coming out in that series, and I recommend you check them out. They're really good, they're really fun, and many of them have really fun premises that are pretty creative. I'll let y'all know when my favorite one of the bunch comes out. Now back to the video. Let's first have a discussion about why I think I evaluate conditions differently than a lot of folks in the community. This will help inform why I rate these 3 conditions so highly once we do get into it. Among the online community, I have noticed this tendency of viewing conditions as almost existing on this linear scale, where you can kind of rank them from objectively best to objectively worst, or objectively strongest to objectively weakest, in a fashion that looks something like this. Unarguably, dead and unconscious would be right at the top, because the enemy is completely and officially out of the fight. And then paralyzed or stunned for X rounds would be a close second, because the enemy is effectively out of the fight, but they have ways of getting back in. Then there'd be a haze, where in the middle sections you can make many arguments for any of the conditions being up, below, wherever. For example, is frightened better or is clumsy better? Is slowed better or is stunned better? There's many different ways to put it, and you can make many valid arguments for a whole lot of orderings. But I'm pretty sure we can all agree that fascinated is like the second worst condition, because it barely impacts combat and is way too easy to break out of. And then doomed is the single worst condition, because enemies don't make recovery checks, so doomed isn't actually a threat to them, and most enemies are going to run to 0 HP before their doomed counter hits 4. And many of you in your head probably have such a list. In that middle hazy range, you might have different orderings for slow, frightened, clumsy, etc. But many will agree that this linear list exists and there's some degree of debate to it. But in reality, I think evaluating conditions needs to be a multi-dimensional thing. You can sort of evaluate along the 5 fundamental axes of power that I talked about in the video linked above, and well, you'd evaluate it along 4 of those axes because versatility is not really applicable here. So if you look at the list above, all we're really evaluating is how potent the condition is. Dead/unconscious is the most potent condition. Doomed is the least potent condition. But that's just one axis. There are still 3 relevant axes to discuss. How efficiently can you inflict this condition? How reliably can you inflict this condition? How sustainable is it when you're attempting to inflict this condition, etc.? And I think if you look at conditions holistically with all of this context in mind, you will sort of naturally arrive to the conclusions that I did about these 3 conditions that I'm going to talk about being incredibly strong. Now, everyone knows some of the meta conditions. Frightened is a good condition to have, and so are many of the other -1 conditions like clumsy and stupefied. Enfeebled might be the only one that's not actually that good. Drained is a good condition to have. Blinded is obviously a good condition to have, and slowed and stunned are practically part of the meta because of how good they are against single targets. Let's not talk about the ones everyone knows are good. The 3 specific conditions really shine when evaluated with these 4 fundamental axes in mind and are otherwise really easy to underrate. The first condition I wanted to talk about is confused. And here's my hot take for the day. Confused is genuinely a contender for the single strongest condition in the game. If I had to put any condition up there, I think confused would be a number 1. Is it the most potent? Nope, obviously not. That being said, it is still much more potent than many believe, and let's get into why I think that. I've seen many folks dismiss it because, well, confusion means they might randomly target their friends, but they might also randomly target me and my friends, so it's not that good, they can still hit me. I think that criticism misses the forest for the trees. I don't think randomly hurting enemies is the point of the condition. I think it's a cherry on top of a pretty delicious cake. Confused is a really multi-layered condition. The best case scenario is that they are going to randomly attack their friends. But the second best case scenario is still pretty damn good. Even if for their whole turn they never attack one of their friends, they only attack you and the other player characters, they're still unable to focus fire and prioritize targets. This is often enough to just completely erase the threat an enemy poses. See my Guardian tanking video linked above for an elaboration on why. So even if you don't get the best case scenario of them attacking their own friends, where they both fail to pose a threat to you and actually speed up your party's tempo, the second best case is still pretty damn good, where they just don't hurt your party all that much because they failed to focus fire. And even if that fails, even if they randomly roll to focus fire, confused is still a pretty damn good condition because they can't use meta strikes. For example, if you're in the front line against a Gug, they cannot use their mapless multi-strike ability. They can't cast non-cantrip spells, so nothing like a wall spell or even a basic fireball, nothing like that. They can't use grab, they can't use swallow whole, they can't use any of their reactions, like reactive strike being the obvious one, but monsters can have many other reactions. They can't use breath weapons, they can't reposition of their own volition, only at random. The GM is basically not allowed to have fun. They can either strike, or use cantrips, or take auxiliary actions that enable the first 2 if for some reason they couldn't do those first 2, like line of sight reasons. And I think people's discussions always forget how big the third layer of this condition is. Remember, number 3 is as bad as this condition gets. It cannot get any worse than that. At a baseline, the enemy, even if they got to focus fire their most ideal target for some reason, because of just bad luck on your part, they still don't get to use any of their actually threatening abilities. Take a look at the monsters in Pathfinder. The vast majority of them past level 0 are going to have at least one ability that's not a basic strike or cantrip. And frankly, by levels 8+, every single monster is going to have multiple of those. So not getting to use that, a condition that simply said enemies cannot use anything other than strikes or cantrips, is already a fantastic condition. Confused gives you a little something on top of that, because other than the fact that they're locked into strikes and cantrips, there's also a chance they fail to properly prioritize targets, and there's a chance that they'll actually attack their own friends, all of which is fantastic. But here's the thing, Confused is not a total shutdown, right? Like paralyzed or stunned. And that means that in the game's design, it is extremely undercosted. What do I mean by undercosted? The most obvious example of this is incapacitation. What I really mean is that when you get to do something powerful and good, there's often checks and balances making sure that you're not ripping the game apart with it. Well, Confuse barely has any of those checks and balances. Like I said, incapacitation, often put on spells that do a total shutdown, not inflicted on the Confused condition because it isn't a total shutdown. It's effectively a shutdown, but it doesn't actually shut you down. You still get to make strikes and cantrips, and thus it does not have the incapacitation trait. And even the other forms of costs. For example, things might be costed by being less reliable, less sustainable, less efficient. None of those seem to particularly apply to options that inflict Confused. In fact, it's very easy to reliably inflict confusion on your foes. Confusion itself is a 4th rank spell, and if the foe fails their saving throw, they're confused, and if they succeed, they're still stunned 1, which is a pretty good consolation prize. You took away 1 action instead of nearly completely shutting them down. Confusing Cry can do the same, but as an area of effect. Confusing Colors is a more flexible area of effect that actually confuses for multiple rounds potentially, and inflicts the Dazzled condition for free with no saving throw attached. So your consolation prize even works if the enemy crit succeeds on their save. 8th rank Confusion takes Confusion 4 and applies it to 10 different targets, and many of them are going to fail if you have actually managed to get close to the max number of targets, and the Ashen Rune calls for a saving throw against Confused on every single crit you do, with no additional action economy on your part. So why do I say Confused is the strongest condition in the game? Because it is so potent as to feel like an effective shutdown, even if it's not a literal shutdown. Like, I'd definitely say Confused shuts an enemy down more than Slowed 1 or Stunned 1 would, but it's not costed like a condition that shuts enemies down. Those conditions typically tend to be attached to very unreliable effects. Typically with the incapacitation trait, Confusion typically isn't attached to that trait. Or those effects take an efficiency hit somewhere, and Confusion doesn't really suffer from that either. So Confused genuinely might be the best condition in the game. The next condition I wanted to talk about is Immobilized. And not just the condition Immobilized, but a whole host of things that are not codified as conditions, but still effectively immobilize the enemy. So I'm including that in here. I'll get into details on that later on. The short of it is that Pathfinder's NPCs just generally tend to be very heavily melee focused. That is just true across the board. Most NPCs primarily have melee options, with ranged options generally being a backup, sometimes just not present at all. There's plenty of NPCs that just don't have ranged options, like a lot of animals, for example. And ranged options generally tend to have lower damage and/or accuracy. This is even true on dedicated ranged enemies. Enemies that are designed to operate at range, like dedicated archers and crossbow users, will typically do less damage or have less accuracy than creatures of that level if they were able to engage in melee. Spellcasting enemies are, of course, an exception to this. Spells simply have uniform scaling through and through, and in fact, spell attack scaling is higher for NPCs than it is for players, so spell-using NPCs will generally do great damage at range, but martial-oriented enemies will typically do less damage. And of course, ranged comes with plenty of its own tactical downsides. Look into my video linked above for a deep dive into melee versus ranged, but it's not like ranged is all upsides of operating at a distance. Aside from having lower damage, you also may have to deal with things like cover, for example. So forcing enemies to be at range is a good thing, and Immobilized can, in the best case scenario, force an enemy into using ranged options. This is just true. Immobilize an enemy on an early turn, and they may be forced to just operate at range, which players are generally better at unless the enemy is a spellcaster. And again, just like with Confused, there is a tendency here to look at this best case and then evaluate it as, if I don't get this best case, everything about it sucks. Just like how with the Confused condition, there were a lot of people who pendulumed all the way to the other extreme of saying, if I don't get the enemy to attack my other enemy, this condition was worthless. Just like that, there are a lot of folks who think Immobilized has no value, because what if the enemy had already closed into melee before you immobilize them? Which can very easily happen. But again, just like with the Confused case, it's not correct to miss the forest for the trees like this. Even if you don't force the enemy into using ranged options, their action quality is ruined. I talk a little bit about action quality in my How to Deal with Boss Fights video linked above. An action is not an action is not an action. One action spent on something that is not your most optimal thing is kind of like losing quarter of an action or half of an action. If you immobilize an enemy right next to your tank, all of the actions it spends attacking those tanks are actions it could have spent approaching and attacking a squishy spellcaster in the backline. So even if an enemy has already closed into melee, Immobilized still has value because it'll degrade the enemy's action quality. And this can be very hard to see. Immobilized is so underrated because when Immobilized does a good thing, it's invisible. To some degree, that's also true for Confused, but it's especially true for Immobilized. You have to imagine that alternate timeline in which the enemy got to freely move around, get to your spellcaster and just outright grab or restrain or swallow them, and that is the timeline that immobilizing them next to your guardian prevented. And here's where we'll get into the and similar portion. Immobilized is not the only way of immobilizing an enemy. That condition is obviously the most direct way of doing so, but plenty of options, in particular difficult terrain, can almost or even completely immobilize a foe. Difficult terrain gets an honorable mention here because it is often attached to the immobilized condition or attached to other benefits that basically feel like immobilizing a foe. Entangling Flora, for example, is difficult terrain, which is, if you think about it, no save, reduce the enemy's speed by half. Then they get a save to reduce their speed by a further 10 if they fail, or get completely immobilized if they critically fail. Likewise, Freezing Rain is difficult terrain, and then on turns 2 and later, it is a little bit of damage and potentially slowed 1 or even slowed 2. An enemy who is slowed inside difficult terrain is effectively immobilized. It's very hard for them to do something useful, especially given how big of an area of difficult terrain Freezing Rain creates and how you can move it every single turn. So because of that, it basically functions like immobilization. You have effectively neutered an enemy's ability to move to where they would like to be. Corrosive Muck is greater difficult terrain, and greater difficult terrain all on its own will immobilize foes. I can tell you this from practice. I have seen foes with movement speeds of upwards of 60 feet simply unable to move because they happen to be large enough that every single square of movement was still leaving them inside that greater difficult terrain. It would have taken them several actions to just get out of the Corrosive Muck, and because it was so expensive to get out, they simply chose not to. They stayed in the Corrosive Muck, kept taking damage, and tried to land lucky hits and crits on the front line. So when thinking about Immobilized, don't just think about the condition, capital I Immobilized. Think about all of the things combined that make an enemy unable to move, because restricting enemy movement is fantastic. In the best case, it forces them to use really bad ranged options. In the average case, it at least degrades their action quality, forcing them to hit suboptimal targets, forcing them to stay in areas that they don't like being in, forcing them to repeatedly take damage, forcing them to potentially trigger reactions, forcing them to incur the multiple attack penalty, etc. And one nice thing about Immobilized is that marshals can very easily get in on the fun. Confused is mostly a spellcaster's domain. The Ashen Rune is pretty much the only universal way for marshals to access this condition, and that rune is uncommon. And because it has a fixed DC, it's only relevant in specific level ranges. So level 9 to, say, 11-ish, and then 16 to 18-ish when you get the Greater Ashen Rune. And outside those level ranges, it's not really relevant. You can't rely on the enemy to fail that confused saving throw. And while there are marshals who can confuse enemies, like, say, a high-level commander, these options tend to be not quite as plentiful, not quite as reliable, and usually available much later than equivalent spellcaster actions. But for Immobilized, that's not the case. It's very easy for any marshal who wants to get in on the fun. Melee marshals can use the Rooting Rune. And notably, this rune does not have the issue that the Ashen Rune does. The DC does not matter for the Rooting Rune. When you crit the enemy with the Rooting Rune, they are immobilized. The DC only comes into play once they commit to spending an action to escape. But until that point, they are immobilized, and once they're not immobilized, they'll have spent a minimum of one action, and in the right level ranges, potentially more than one action. And of course, they will have incurred the multiple attack penalty because the escape action has the attack trait. Grievous is for crossbow marshals. It basically steals the critical specialization effect of regular bows that immobilizes foes and bolts it onto a crossbow. And of course, bow-using marshals innately have the immobilization. They don't need any rune to do so. If they have access to crit specs via their class or an ancestry feat, they can simply immobilize foes every time they crit. So this is a fantastic way for marshals to get in on the fun, and it's a great way of supporting your spellcasters, because, as I keep telling everyone, marshals are also meant to cheerlead casters just as much as casters are meant to cheerlead them. Immobilize the foe, and your friend who's standing 15 feet away from the backline will feel much safer doing all the things casters like to do. And that covers it for the immobilized condition. I wouldn't call this anywhere near the top best conditions in the game. Remember, I made the bold claim that Confuse might genuinely be the single best condition. Not gonna make such a claim for Immobilized, but it's a pretty strong condition and pretty heavily underrated because degrading enemy action quality is invisible, but it has a lot of benefits. Now let's talk about my favorite condition in the game, Dazzled, and its spiritual inverse, Concealed, because they're effectively the same condition. The observer needs to make a DC 5 flat check to target their target. So I'm going to use those two interchangeably for the rest of the slide. Dazzled and Concealed are probably the most underrated conditions in the game. Underrated by the community, and ironically, underrated by Paizo's designers, in my opinion. Dazzled is easily the most undercosted condition in the game. I called Confused undercosted, mostly because I was surprised at how it's effectively taking a foe out of a fight, but because it isn't actually doing so, it is allowed to do so without things like incapacitation attached, but it still requires enemies to fail saving throws, for instance, right? Dazzled doesn't even have that downside. It is incredibly easy to very, very, very reliably inflict Dazzled on foes. Right away at rank 2, you have symmetric, no-save Concealed via Mist. Mist goes both ways. It makes everything concealed to everyone observing it, and this can be a boon for your party, but also a bane. With coordination, any party can make good use of Mist, though, especially because there's many player-facing options that let you kind of see through these anyways. But if the symmetry is a problem for you, Revealing Light is at the same rank and available to every single spell tradition. And Revealing Light says, on anything but a critical success, every enemy in the area is going to be dazzled for a minimum of 2 rounds. On a success, it's 2 rounds. On a failure or critical failure, it's more. So Revealing Light is already incredibly consistent if the symmetry is an issue for you, and if your party knows how to coordinate around symmetric Concealed, then Mist is always available. And then at rank 3, you get asymmetric no-save Dazzled in the form of Hypnotize. Now, I call this asymmetric because even though a player standing in the area would be dazzled, the area is small enough that players can always stand around it while only enemies are inside it, especially if your party's a little bit clever about coordinating things like reach and range. And then the enemies inside Hypnotize are just permanently dazzled until they leave the area, which costs actions and triggers reactions and is something your party can coordinate around with things like trip or grab. So already between ranks 2 and 3, it's really easy to one-sidedly inflict Dazzled on any number of foes because all of these are area effects, and these area effects are also relevant against bosses. More on that later. And then rank 4 onwards, you get Dazzled with benefits effects like Rust Cloud or Confusing Colors. Rust Cloud damages foes in the area while doing symmetric concealment, and then Confusing Colors potentially confuses foes while doing asymmetric Dazzled, similar to Hypnotize. And there's a lot of effects that are dazzled with benefits or concealed with benefits, like Frozen Fog is another one that comes to mind. And all of them are pretty powerful. When they're asymmetric, like say Confusing Colors, it's obvious why they're powerful, but even when they're symmetric, their effects make up for the potential missed damage. Yes, if you throw enemies in a Rust Cloud or Frozen Fog or something similar, your party might whiff a couple of attacks going into that area, but that's okay because for as long as enemies stay in that area, they're taking round after round of damage from those AoE spells, and that's going to add up and more than cover for any potential missed damage. And again, just like with Mist, it's not hard for a party to coordinate around it. And this is all spells that I mentioned, but marshals can get in on the fun too. You can get unconditional concealed by simply drinking a mist form elixir. You can use a flickering rune to crit and inflict dazzled on foes. There is also a stronger critical effect that inflicts dazzled. Y'all may know which one I'm talking about, but more on that near the end of this slide. But why do I value dazzled so much? Because you may not agree with me that it's undercosted and underrated if you just think the effect's not that good. Well, think of the two sides of the same coin. If you're facing a boss, it serves as a flat 20% chance of whiffing anything they do. Anything with a target, of course, but that's still pretty damn crazy. Mathematically, it would be like throwing a -2 untyped penalty on the things a boss does. A -2, for example, if they were hitting you on a 5 and critting you on a 15, you would make them hit on a 7 and crit on a 17. So it's a 20% differential. That's why -2. But it's important to note it's actually a little bit better than that -2. Because the -2 made 5 and 6 into misses from hits, and 15 and 16 into hits from crits. Whereas Dazzled makes any crits that it touches also just completely whiff. It doesn't downgrade them into hits, they just fully whiff. And that is huge. Dazzled is one of those conditions where, yes, on a single roll, there's only a 1 in 5 chance it's going to matter, but inflict it on a boss and have it last multiple rounds, which is really not that hard to do. Right away at rank 2, Revealing Light will make it last for a minimum of 2 rounds if they don't crit succeed, and Hypnotize, Mist, etc. are going to last for as long as the boss stays in the area unless they spend an action to get out of it, right? Make it last 2 to 3 rounds, and even if one of the 6 to 9 actions and 1 to 3 reactions they may have taken in that range becomes a whiff due to Dazzled, it's a huge swing. And if you don't believe me, if you think I'm overrating how powerful Dazzled is, apply this house rule at your tables as a GM, or ask your GM to if you're a player. Instead of rolling the flat check before rolling the attack roll, saving throw, etc., roll that first. Roll the attack roll or skill check or saving throw first, and then roll the flat check to see if your Dazzled caused it to whiff. Mathematically, nothing's changing. There's no real difference between rolling Dazzled first and later. All that's changing is now, as a GM or player, you'll have a tangible number in front of you that says, oh, that boss was going to crit me with that 15, and Dazzle just made that whiff. And putting it that way will make you realize how much it matters to have 1 in 5 things the boss does whiff. And then when you're not up against the boss, when you're against crowds of foes or minions, because of how undercosted the condition is, it's really easy to have it on multiple targets. Every single spell I mentioned above is an area of effect spell. And the Flickering Rune from Marshals, for example, is activated on a crit, which it's not hard to crit minions, even multiple times in a turn. And when more targets are dazzled, it means you're more likely to have dazzled whiff something. If the boss made 5 attacks, 1 of them on average was going to whiff. If the enemies combined made 15 attacks, 3 of them on average are going to whiff. And of course, there is some swinginess to it. If Dazzled makes something that was multiple attack penalty number 10 whiff, then it's not going to feel that great. So there is a bit of swinginess attached to it, but Dazzled is still effectively a -2 untyped penalty against bosses and a -1 untyped penalty against most mooks, and that is fantastic given how unconditionally easy it is to inflict. Now let's talk about Dazzled and Concealed's older brother, Blinded and Hidden. Blinded is much more inconsistent in its costing. I called Dazzled pretty universally undercosted, and I think that's true. But Blinded, not so much. You are going to find things that inflict the blinded condition that are pretty heftily costed. Dizzying colors and blindness, for example, have the incapacitation trait. You're not going to find these universally undercosted. But it's weird because there are a few things that are really, really undercosted for the fact that they're inflicting blinded and hidden. And remember, blinded is a devastating condition. Unlike Dazzled and Concealed, blinded and hidden are not exactly the same. Hidden is a very good condition because there's a DC 11 flat check to target you, and foes are off guard to you. Blinded has both of those things true, everything is hidden to you, and you treat everything as difficult terrain. So blinded is a devastating condition to get on a foe, and it's terribly easy to inflict with something like the Greater Phantasmal Doorknob. This is what I was alluding to when I said Dazzled is easy to get with crits that are not Flickering Rune. The Phantasmal Doorknob inflicts Dazzled on a crit, and that's pretty reasonable. Greater Phantasmal Doorknob does Blinded on a crit and is an incredibly powerful, potentially broken item because of it. Likewise, it's not hard to get unconditional hidden on a character. Heightened Invisibility is just a rank 4 spell. That means level 7 and higher characters will have access to it, and by level 11 or so, it'll start feeling spammable. And if that's not enough, Disappearance is a rank 8 spell, and when combined with something like Hidden Mind, can be incredibly devastating against most foes, especially if the party coordinates around it. So Blinded and Hidden are a little bit weird because you may not find very impressive performance off of most options that have them, and then a handful of them have really, really good performance, potentially broken performance. That being said, this slide is about Dazzled being the most underrated condition in the game, and I stand by it, especially for the first half of the level range where Blinded and Hidden are not that easy to universally and unconditionally inflict. So Dazzled and Concealed are a great way to tilt the enemy's action quality further and further away from them because it adds a whiff chance to nearly everything they might do. And because they're so underrated, it's crazy how reliable the conditions are. Now it's time for a bonus round. I've talked about 3 underrated conditions, evaluating them along my 5 or 4, in this case, fundamental axes of power. Now let's talk about what is arguably the most overrated condition in the game, dead/unconscious. This is a talking point you're gonna see in online discourse a lot. Dead is the best condition. Unconscious is the best condition. It's so common, in fact, that I don't just see it in the Pathfinder community. I see it all the time. I've seen it for years in D&D discourse as well. And I understand that a lot of times people say it flippantly. Like, a lot of the times it does come from a meme area. Like, someone's like, I don't care how big the room is, I cast Fireball. It's just kind of an evolution of that, where someone's like, I don't want to use Slow, I want to use Fireball or Thunderstrike or whatever else, right? But plenty of times people do use this talking point seriously. It is unironically used as justification for prioritizing damage per round over everything else. The entire argument boils down to an enemy is at their least dangerous when they're at 0 HP. 0 HP is, if it were a condition, the strongest condition in the game. Therefore, all your resources, all your effort should be spent on maximizing the chances and minimizing the time it takes to get the enemy to 0 HP, and everything else is suboptimal. And that is not actually true in practice. It only appears true because of that linear list we talked about earlier, the one that was only accounting for the potency axis. Once you account for the other axes of power, it's actually very close to the weakest condition in the game. Obviously, it has the highest potency. By far, no one can ever argue that 0 HP is not the most potent condition in the game, because an enemy at 0 HP is even less dangerous than an enemy who is completely paralyzed, right? But now let's look at the other axes. First, efficiency. The efficiency of getting an enemy to 0 HP is really not all that high, because doing high damage as fast as possible requires rushing into melee. If your goal is to give the opponent as little uptime as possible, you will ironically end up giving them more uptime this way. Because like I said in my melee versus range tactics video, the best thing about being in melee is having all this high damage, amazing reactions, amazing control, etc. And the worst thing about it is that your enemies get to have that too, because enemies are also built to melee like you. So simply by virtue of aiming to raise damage, you are reducing your party's efficiency. Conversely, if you don't use melee as your way to raise damage, you're probably not going to deal enough damage for 0 HP to be reached fast enough to not need anything else along the way, and you will naturally evolve into a playstyle where you're not just rushing damage. Then let's talk about sustainability. Sustainability for this is actually very low. Rushing an enemy with damage eats up a lot of resources. This is especially true in high-level play, because in high-level play, spells are the ones that do the most damage, not martials, not even melee martials. Spells are the ones that do the most damage, unless you have a group of melee martials that are coordinated to do like reaction chaining, or if you have like a magus that's being very well supported. Aside from a couple of exceptions like that, the best way to deal damage at higher levels is going to just be high rank spells, and that means focusing on damage over everything else is just unsustainable. But even if your damage dealers are martials, it is still going to eat up the caster's resources. So even in low level play, where you're able to just one-shot mooks and 3-shot bosses, well, standing in melee and exposing yourself to melee means you need healing. Healing that is typically going to come from a backliner spending 2 actions on a heal spell, probably in their max 2 ranks, meaning that now you have worsened both your efficiency and your sustainability simply by committing to a melee. And finally, reliability. Reliability for rushing enemies to 0 HP is pretty low, and this might be subtle because your instincts might be, it's just +1s. Just give them a whole bunch of +1s, give them a whole bunch of passive boosts to damage, add damage riders. Damage is so easy to stack in this game, right? Sure, it's theoretically easy to stack, it's just it takes a lot of stacking to actually make that damage matter. Remember, if you don't drop the enemy a turn sooner than you otherwise would have, your investment actually did nothing. It had no impact on the combat. If an enemy has 150 HP, and your party collectively deals 50 damage per round, they're going to drop in 3 turns. 3 rounds, I apologize. Until you go to 75 DPR, you are not reliably bringing them down any sooner. You might unreliably do so, like maybe you get to 60 DPR and then a high enough portion of that 60 DPR comes from the person who won initiative against that enemy that the enemy drops before their turn rolls around. But you're not going to consistently bring that enemy down in 2 rounds unless you're in that 75 DPR range. So you need to increase your damage output by 150% to make the enemy down 1 round sooner than they otherwise would have. That takes a massive investment. That means to have even a little bit of reliability, you have to really give up on both efficiency and sustainability and expend a ton of resources into maximizing your damage. Not to mention the opportunity cost that goes into maximizing your damage. Here's where the 5th axis, versatility, comes back. All of the conditions we have discussed so far, they just take like 1 rune or 1 spell or something like that. They're not meaningfully hurting your versatility. But increasing your damage from like 50 DPR to 75, a 150% jump in damage, requires so much investment on your character sheet and all of your party members' character sheets that it's effectively not worth it. So maximizing damage is actually one of the worst ways of winning fights. You do need a good amount of damage. You can't get through Pathfinder without dealing any damage, but trying to rush the enemy to 0 HP is not the game you're playing. Holding back your tempo is actually important, and using other aspects of your character sheet that are not just damage and things that directly increase damage is really important to consistently winning combats because of how unreliable damage races inherently are. A very succinct way of putting it is this: dead may be the strongest condition in the game, but damaged is by far the weakest condition in the game. Because that 150 HP enemy, it does not matter if they're at 149 or 1 HP, they're equally dangerous on round 3 of combat unless you had got them down to 0. And because you cannot reliably do that, that's why the whole dead is the best condition in the game thing is a myth. Unconscious and dead are actually the weakest condition in the game, and that's why they're the last thing you do in a combat. You go through all the steps of getting other useful conditions, adjusting your party's tempo, and then deliver the killing blow, because at that point it's a foregone conclusion that you'll win. Try to get into damage races, and no matter how optimized your party is, you're not going to win difficult combats consistently unless your GM is making sure these combats are catered to lose to you in some way or the other. That will be all for today's video, folks. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope the video sparked a little bit of thinking and creativity in how you view different conditions and how you evaluate them and how you build your characters and parties to use these conditions. Hey, maybe as a GM, there's a monster you were underrating that now you understand is crazy because of how good these conditions are. If you like this video, please like and comment. If you'd like to see more of my comment in the future, please subscribe and click the channel notification button. If you'd like to directly support me, consider joining a channel membership or checking out the sponsor link in the video description below and buying one of their one-shots, because I will get a small commission from that. Regardless, I'll see you next time. Mathfinder out.